They were not just kings. To the people of ancient Egypt, the pharaohs were gods in human form, divine beings chosen by the heavens to rule the earth. Their crowns did not merely symbolize political power, they were believed to radiate spiritual authority granted directly by Ra, Osiris, and Horus. When a pharaoh ascended the throne, he was no longer a mortal man. He became a living god, the bridge between the realm of humans and the eternal world of the gods. And with such power came an obsession, the preservation of that divine blood. But how does one keep divinity pure? The answer for the pharaohs was simple, yet deeply disturbing to us today. They would marry their own sisters, their own daughters, their own flesh and blood. To the ancient Egyptians, incest inside the royal family was not an abomination. It was sacred. It was duty. It was a ritual of blood that bound the king to his gods, and his gods to the throne. This concept of divine kingship shaped everything in Egyptian society. The people believed the pharaoh's blood was infused with the essence of the gods themselves. If that blood were to be diluted by marrying a commoner, then the pharaoh's offspring might lose that sacred spark. To prevent such pollution, the royal family closed itself in. Brother married sister. Father married daughter. And generation after generation, this cycle repeated. If you visit the ancient temples today, you will find carvings that glorify these unions. Pharaohs standing tall, hand in hand with queens who were also their sisters. Inscriptions describing how their marriages reflected the union of Osiris and Isis, the divine siblings whose love and bond symbolized eternity. To outsiders, it looks like a twisted tale of incest. But to the ancient Egyptians, it was a mirror of the gods. If Osiris married his sister Isis, then why shouldn't Pharaoh marry his own? Yet behind the golden mask of sacred ritual was something far darker. These marriages were not always driven by love or passion. They were arrangements, often forced, meant to secure the throne. A young girl, barely into her teenage years, might be given to her older brother, the pharaoh, because the priests and the court demanded it. The queen mother might even be drawn back into the cycle, becoming both mother and wife in a twisted loop of blood and power. The idea was clear: keep the throne pure. Keep the power inside. But in practice, this obsession created a dynasty haunted by fragility. The rulers appeared divine to the masses, yet within their private chambers lay the consequences of centuries of inbreeding. Deformed limbs. Weak bones. Children born sickly, often dying before they could ever wear the crown. The cost of protecting the so-called divine bloodline was slowly eroding it from within. One of the most striking aspects of this practice is how openly it was celebrated. There was no shame. The pharaohs did not hide their incestuous unions, they carved them into stone, immortalizing their choices for eternity. Cleopatra, the last great queen of Egypt, married her brothers as a political necessity. She is remembered as a cunning seductress in Roman history, but in Egypt, her marriages were nothing extraordinary. She was simply following the same tradition that had bound pharaohs to their sisters and daughters for centuries. And yet, for all its divine justification, there is an undeniable layer of lust and perversion in these unions. Accounts suggest that the pharaohs did not merely view these marriages as symbolic, but fully consummated them. The act itself was considered a ritual, a way of uniting the essence of gods in human flesh. The royal bedchamber was not just a place of passion, it was an altar. Every kiss, every touch, every act of intercourse between siblings was framed as a reenactment of divine myth. It was theater, religion, and sex, all blended into one. Imagine the scene: a temple lit by oil lamps, shadows flickering across the walls. The priests chanting hymns to Isis and Osiris. The crowd waiting outside, believing their king is performing the holy union that would bless the land with fertility and abundance. And inside, behind closed doors, a brother lies with his sister. This was not scandal. This was worship. But even among the Egyptians, not everyone accepted this blindly. There were whispers, quiet doubts among the common people. They saw the frail princes, the limping heirs, the coughing children of the palace. They must have wondered, if the blood of the gods is so pure, why does it produce rulers so sickly? Why do so many heirs die before their time? But questioning the divine nature of Pharaoh was dangerous. To doubt him was to doubt the gods themselves. And so, the whispers stayed whispers, hidden behind the golden mask of obedience. The divine bloodline was also a weapon of politics. By marrying within the family, Pharaoh cut off the ambitions of other nobles. No outsider could claim the throne through marriage. No rival family could sneak into power by wedding their daughter to the king. The incestuous cycle was not only about faith, it was also about control. By keeping the crown locked in a prison of blood, Pharaoh ensured his dynasty's survival. But survival at what cost? As centuries passed, the cracks widened. DNA does not lie. And modern science has revealed the truth hidden beneath the sands. The royal bloodline was not divine, it was poisoned by itself. The pharaohs, so desperate to appear as gods, were slowly destroying their own humanity. Yet in their minds, this was the only way. Without these unions, they feared the gods would abandon them. Without sister-wives and daughter-wives, the Nile might stop flooding, the crops might wither, the sun might turn its face away from Egypt. Fear and faith intertwined, binding them to a destiny they could not escape. So when you look at the golden mask of Tutankhamun, or the statues of Cleopatra and her brothers, remember this. Behind the beauty, behind the power, lies a truth darker than the desert night. The pharaohs believed themselves to be gods. But in their desperate attempt to hold on to divinity, they became prisoners of their own blood. And this is only the beginning. For as we journey deeper into the history of Egypt's royal family, we will uncover not just the tragedies of inbreeding, but the perverse rituals that transformed incest into spectacle, and lust into religion. He is perhaps the most famous pharaoh in the world. His golden mask has become the very symbol of ancient Egypt. Yet behind the beauty of Tutankhamun's treasures lies a story soaked in tragedy, weakness, and the devastating cost of a dynasty chained to incest. Tutankhamun, the boy king who ruled Egypt for less than a decade, was himself the product of brother and sister. His life, and his early death, reveal the terrible consequences of the royal obsession with keeping their blood pure. When Tutankhamun's tomb was first opened in 1922, the world was mesmerized by its riches. The mask of solid gold, the jewels, the chariots, the weapons, all spoke of glory. But when modern scientists began examining his mummy centuries later, the truth was revealed. Tutankhamun was not a healthy, strong ruler. He was a fragile boy, racked with deformities and disease, struggling just to walk. His very body carried the scars of the pharaoh's darkest secret, their incestuous unions. DNA analysis conducted in the 21st century confirmed what many historians had suspected. Tutankhamun's father was Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who had tried to abolish Egypt's gods in favor of worshipping a single deity, the Aten. His mother, however, was not Akhenaten's wife, Nefertiti, as many once believed. Instead, she was Akhenaten's sister, an unnamed woman who shared the same royal blood. Brother and sister had conceived Tutankhamun, binding him into a genetic prison before he even entered the world. The results were catastrophic. Tutankhamun was born with a cleft palate. His spine was curved and twisted. His foot was clubbed, forcing him to rely on canes to walk. In fact, when his tomb was excavated, archaeologists found more than 130 walking sticks buried with him, a silent testimony to his constant pain. He suffered from necrosis of the bone in his foot, a condition that left him unable to stand for long periods. He was also plagued by malaria, which ravaged his frail body repeatedly throughout his short life. Imagine being a teenager, placed on the throne of one of the most powerful empires in history, while barely being able to walk. Imagine being worshipped as a god while your body crumbled beneath you. Tutankhamun's reign was a paradox. He held absolute divine authority, but inside, he was a sickly boy, a victim of his ancestors' choices. The very image of him, his mask, his treasures, projected power and eternity. But the reality was far different. His body, examined by CT scans, showed evidence of multiple fractures, possibly the result of a chariot accident, or perhaps even foul play. Some scholars believe he was murdered, struck down because he was too weak to control the throne. Others argue that his fragile bones simply broke under the strain of his own weight and illness. Whatever the cause, His death at the age of 19 was the inevitable outcome of a life built on genetic fragility. Tutankhamun was not alone. He was the symbol of a pattern that had haunted the royal family for generations. By marrying their sisters and daughters, the pharaohs believed they were imitating the gods, preserving divine blood. But in truth, they were condemning their heirs to deformity and early death. The so-called god kings were becoming less godlike with every generation. What makes Tutankhamun's story even more haunting is the way the Egyptians tried to cover up his weaknesses. In public art, he was shown as strong, tall, riding chariots, slaying enemies. The reliefs and carvings presented him as a perfect warrior king. But behind those images was a reality of crutches, pain, and exhaustion. He may have posed for statues, but in daily life, he limped across palace floors, leaning heavily on his walking sticks, struggling to fulfill the role of a divine ruler. Even in death, the tragedy followed him. Scientists discovered that his body had been burned after burial, possibly due to a chemical reaction caused by poor embalming practices. His corpse was charred, disfigured, as though even the afterlife denied him peace. The glorious treasures of his tomb stand in sharp contrast to the broken boy who lay inside. But Tutankhamun's tragedy was not only physical. It was political. Because he was so weak, others ruled in his name. Powerful advisors, generals, and priests used him as a puppet. The boy king was the face of Egypt, but the true power was exercised by those around him. His short reign was marked less by his own achievements and more by the attempts of others to restore stability after his father Akhenaten's disastrous religious revolution. And yet, despite his weakness, despite his short life, Tutankhamun's name has endured. Ironically, he is one of the few pharaohs remembered today, not because of what he achieved, but because his tomb remained almost intact, hidden from grave robbers for over 3,000 years. When Howard Carter broke the seal in 1922, he uncovered not only gold and jewels, but also a story that would reshape how we view the pharaohs. The boy king's fragile body became evidence against the myth of divine blood. Modern science stripped away the golden mask to reveal the cost of incest. Behind the splendor of Egypt's rituals lay genetic damage, sickness, and early death. Tutankhamun, celebrated as a god, was in reality a symbol of human fragility, a child born into a prison of bloodlines too tightly woven together. There is also an eerie detail. Tutankhamun's own wife, Enkhesenamun, was his half-sister, the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. The cycle continued. Brother married sister, once again. Their union, too, was cursed. They tried to conceive children, but the fetuses found in Tutankhamun's tomb, two small, mummified daughters, were stillborn. Both bore signs of severe congenital defects. Even in the next generation, the dynasty could not escape the curse of its own blood. This endless loop of sibling marriages did not create gods. It created ghosts, children who never lived, heirs who never reigned, kings who died before they could grow beards. The obsession with divine purity had hollowed out the dynasty from the inside. Tutankhamun's short, painful life stands as the most vivid testimony of this dark truth. To the people of his time, he was Horus on earth, a living god. To us, he is a reminder that power and divinity are illusions. DNA cannot be tricked by religion or ritual. And when rulers define nature in the name of gods, it is their children who pay the price. As you look at his golden mask, shining in museums today, remember the boy beneath. Not the god, not the king, but the fragile human being, limping across marble halls, coughing in the night, carrying the weight of an empire on bones too weak to bear it. He was both the glory and the doom of Egypt's obsession with blood. And Tutankhamun's tragedy was only a chapter in a larger story. For the rituals of incest were not limited to his parents, nor to his generation. They stretched across centuries, transforming marriage into sacred theater, and sex into religion. In the next chapter of this tale, we will step inside the temples where these rituals unfolded, not in whispers, but in full view of the gods themselves. Marriage between siblings was never just about family. In ancient Egypt, it was transformed into ritual. What we might see as scandal and perversion, the Egyptians elevated into ceremony, theater, even religion. To them, the union of brother and sister was not merely tolerated, it was sanctified. And when Pharaoh lay with his sister wife, he was not only consummating marriage, he was reenacting the myths of gods, binding Egypt to eternity through flesh. The mythology was simple, yet powerful. The god Osiris had married his sister, Isis. Their sacred bond produced Horus, the falcon-headed god who became the eternal symbol of kingship. For Egyptians, Pharaoh was Horus incarnate, the living god on earth. And if Horus was born of divine incest, then Pharaoh must continue the cycle. Every royal union between siblings was seen as a reflection of that original, cosmic marriage. By lying with his sister, Pharaoh was not indulging in lust, he was affirming his divine right to rule. But rituals like these were not whispered in shadows. They were staged in temples, inscribed on walls, and overseen by priests. There are accounts of ceremonial unions taking place before sacred statues, where Pharaoh and his queen enacted the role of Osiris and Isis. Priests chanted, incense filled the air, and the people believed that the gods themselves were present in the chamber. The act of sex, normally hidden in private, became something holy, a performance that blessed the land with fertility. To consummate incest was to call forth the Nile's flood, to ensure the crops would grow, to guarantee that Egypt would not wither in drought. Can you imagine the scene? A dimly lit sanctuary, the statue of a god looming in the background, oil lamps flickering. The royal couple dressed in ceremonial garb, shedding layers as the ritual progressed. Outside, thousands of worshippers gathered, waiting for the priests to declare that the act had been completed, that Pharaoh and his sister wife had once again renewed the contract between gods and men. What we see as taboo, they saw as salvation. Of course, behind this sacred veil was undeniable desire. Pharaoh was surrounded by concubines, slaves, and dancers. Yet the union with his sister or daughter carried a weight none of those liaisons could rival. It was not only pleasure, it was power. In the marriage bed, Pharaoh declared himself both man and god, heir to Osiris. Lust and politics fused together, until it was impossible to separate the two. This ritualization of sex also reinforced Pharaoh's absolute authority. By turning incest into a divine act, the royal family justified what no commoner could ever attempt. For an ordinary Egyptian, incest was forbidden, a crime. But Pharaoh was above human law. His actions were sacred by definition. In this way, the palace turned taboo into privilege. What condemned a farmer would sanctify a king. Consider Cleopatra, the last great ruler of Egypt. She married both of her brothers in succession, as tradition demanded. But for her, the ritual was not only about piety. It was about survival. By tying herself to her brothers, she cut out rival claimants to the throne. Every night she shared her bed with them, she was not only imitating the gods, she was consolidating power. Yet history remembers Cleopatra not for these sacred unions, but for her affairs with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Ironically, her relationships with foreigners shocked the world more than her marriages to her brothers ever did. For Egyptians, her incestuous weddings were not scandalous, they were expected. Still, the darker edge of these rituals cannot be ignored. Priests may have blessed them, myths may have justified them, but the reality was often coercion. A girl, still a child, might be forced into marriage with her much older brother because the gods supposedly demanded it. A father, seeing himself as Osiris, might take his daughter as his wife, turning her body into a vessel for divine legitimacy. The line between religion and exploitation blurred, until there was no line left at all. Some historians believe that certain festivals included public displays of fertility rituals. During celebrations of Hathor, the goddess of love and sexuality, orgiastic rites were said to erupt, with drinking, music, and mass indulgence. In these moments, the boundaries of morality dissolved. The same pattern appeared: what was forbidden in daily life became holy in ritual. Egypt was a land where sex could be transformed into ceremony, and where Pharaoh himself embodied that paradox. But the true power of these rituals lay not just in the act itself, but in the message it sent. Each incestuous union declared, "Pharaoh is not like you. He is a god among mortals. His bed is an altar, his wife a goddess, their children heirs of eternity. To witness it was to accept it. To doubt it was to risk heresy." In this way, Ritualized lust became propaganda. It silenced opposition, bound the people to faith, and cloaked human desire in divine necessity. And yet, beneath the gilded ceremonies, the cracks widened. Every time Pharaoh reenacted the myth of Osiris and Isis with his sister, the cost was borne by the next generation. The heirs grew weaker, the line more fragile. Rituals meant to secure eternity instead planted seeds of decay. Priests may have declared that incest blessed the Nile, but the land itself bore witness to the frailty of kings. It is here that the paradox becomes haunting. Incest in Egypt was not hidden shame, it was public glory. It was carved into walls, sung in hymns, celebrated as divine. But every time Pharaoh embraced his sister wife in ritual, he was condemning his children to sickness, his dynasty to collapse. The very act meant to preserve divinity was destroying it. So when you walk through the temples of Luxor or Karnak, and you see the reliefs of royal couples holding hands, remember this: those scenes are not just images of affection. They are snapshots of rituals where lust was crowned as holy, and power was fused with the flesh. They are evidence of a system where incest was rewritten as destiny. Rituals of lust and power shaped the very identity of Egypt's rulers. They blurred the line between man and God, sacred and profane. They turned bedrooms into sanctuaries, marriages into myths, and children into sacrifices to tradition. And though they shone with divine grandeur, they left behind a legacy of fragility, tragedy, and decline. For Tutankhamun, the boy king broken by incest, the rituals had already taken their toll. For Cleopatra, they were weapons in her political arsenal. For Egypt itself, they were both salvation and curse. The incestuous unions of the pharaohs were not accidents of desire. They were deliberate, orchestrated, sanctified, and ultimately destructive. And so we see that behind the golden glow of Egypt's temples lies a darker truth. What was holy was also perverse. What was celebrated as divine was, in fact, a theater of power and lust. The rituals of incest were never just about love. They were about control. They were about survival. And they were about convincing an entire civilization that sin could be sacred, so long as it was committed by a god. Every empire believes its glory will last forever. The pharaohs of Egypt, cloaked in gold and worshipped as gods, must have thought their power was eternal. They built monuments meant to outlive the desert winds, carved their names into stone to echo through eternity. But what they could not carve away was the weakness growing inside their own blood. Generation after generation of incestuous unions planted a sickness at the heart of the dynasty. And in time, that sickness bloomed, not only in the bodies of their heirs, but in the fate of Egypt itself. For centuries, the divine bloodline had been celebrated as a symbol of strength. Pharaoh was God incarnate, and his children were heirs of heaven. But the more the royal family married within itself, the more fragile its offspring became. Tutankhamun's broken body was not an isolated case, it was a symptom of a deeper rot. Clubfoot, cleft palates, fragile bones, stillborn children, these were the silent tolls of a system obsessed with purity. Each new generation of kings looked less like gods, and more like ghosts. The people of Egypt noticed. They might not have spoken openly, for to question Pharaoh was to risk death, but they saw the signs. They watched rulers die young, heirs vanish before reaching manhood, queens struggling to produce healthy children. A divine bloodline was supposed to guarantee eternal strength, but what they saw instead was fragility. The faith that had bound Egypt together for millennia began to crack. The priests worked tirelessly to maintain the illusion. They staged rituals, carved glorious images, and sang hymns declaring the vitality of Pharaoh. They told the people that every union between brother and sister mirrored the gods, that every sickly heir was still touched by divinity. But belief cannot heal broken bones. Faith cannot erase deformities. And the gap between image and reality widened until even the Nile itself seemed to mock the throne. For Egypt, the strength of its rulers was not just symbolic, it was practical. Pharaoh was expected to lead armies, to ride chariots, to smite enemies with his own hand. But what happens when Pharaoh cannot even walk without a cane? When the king is too frail to wear armor, too sick to command? Power inevitably slips away. Generals take control of the battlefield. Priests take control of the temples. Courtiers and viziers whisper in the palace corridors, ruling in the name of a king who is little more than a fragile puppet. This was the hidden cost of incest. It weakened the very heart of authority. Pharaoh remained God in name, but in reality, his power was shared, stolen, or outright usurped by those around him. And with every weak king, the empire's enemies grew bolder. Foreign invaders who once trembled at the sight of Egypt's armies now saw an opportunity. Hittites, Assyrians, Persians, one after another, they tested the borders. And eventually, Egypt's divine kings could no longer hold them back. The decline was not sudden. It was slow, like the steady erosion of stone by desert winds. But it was relentless. Each generation inherited not only the throne, but also the genetic curses of their ancestors. The royal family had bound itself so tightly to its own bloodline that it left no room for renewal. No new strength entered the line. No fresh power flowed into the dynasty. What was meant to be preservation became decay. Even Cleopatra, centuries after Tutankhamun, bore the weight of this tradition. She married both of her brothers, as custom demanded, and those unions were marked by political strife and personal misery. Her attempt to break free, by aligning herself with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, was both a rebellion against Egypt's insular tradition and a desperate gamble to save her throne. But it was too late. By her time, Egypt was already a pawn in the games of Rome. The divine bloodline had rotted from within, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to the ambitions of empires far stronger. It is chilling to realize that the very practice designed to secure eternity may have hastened the empire's fall. Incest did not simply damage individuals, it destabilized the institution of kingship itself. When Pharaoh was weak, the faith of the people weakened. When heirs died young, succession crises erupted. And when the dynasty could no longer project strength, Egypt's enemies closed in. The seeds of decline had been sown in the royal bedchamber, nurtured by rituals that confused lust with divinity, and watered with the blood of children who never had a chance to grow. Some historians argue that Egypt would have declined regardless. Foreign powers were rising, trade routes were shifting, and no empire lasts forever. But even they admit that the fragility of Egypt's rulers hastened its downfall. Strong kings might have delayed the inevitable. Weak ones hastened it. And few kings were weaker than those born of the incestuous cycle. Today, when we gaze upon the splendor of the pyramids or the treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb, it is easy to forget the human cost. The golden mask hides a boy who limped in pain. The carvings of radiant queens conceal women forced into marriages with their own brothers. The hymns of priests drown out the cries of stillborn children buried in silence. This is the shadow side of Egypt's glory, the price paid for the illusion of divine blood. And so the story of the pharaohs is not just one of triumph, but of tragedy. They believed they were preserving godhood, but in truth, they were condemning themselves to weakness. They believed they were securing eternity, but they were planting the seeds of collapse. The incestuous secrets of the pharaohs did not remain hidden. They carved themselves into the bones of kings, into the tombs of queens, into the very fate of Egypt itself. When Rome finally took Egypt, Cleopatra's death marked not only the end of a dynasty, but the end of a dream, the dream that divine blood could be preserved forever. What remained was not eternity, but ruin. And buried beneath the sands, the mummies of fragile kings whisper the same haunting truth. Power cannot defy nature. No godly myth, no sacred ritual, no golden mask can escape the cost of incest. So the next time you see the treasures of Egypt gleaming in a museum, remember what lies beneath. Behind the splendor is fragility. Behind the divinity is decay. The pharaohs tried to keep themselves gods, but in doing so, they ensured they would die as men. If this gave you chills, leave a like, share your thoughts, and subscribe, because the next tale is even darker.